Bermuda represents a geographical anomaly that should have faced total operational erasure centuries ago. It serves as a literal bullseye for the most violent hurricanes on the planet. This desolate rock possesses zero natural resources and near total isolation. By every standard strategic metric, it is a catastrophic liability. Yet, it has secured an asymmetric advantage, sheltering over 60,000 people in one of the wealthiest territories on Earth. This is a civilization engineered through billion-dollar bets against global destruction. Discard your misconceptions. This is not the Caribbean. There are no protective neighbors within 650 miles. It is a lone speck of defiance adrift in the vast, seemingly endless expanse of the North Atlantic. How did a resource-less speck of land, positioned as a literal bullseye for global destruction, transform its proximity to catastrophe into a billion-dollar engine of wealth? To understand this transformation, we must first address the sheer improbability of this island's existence within a hostile maritime theater. Most nations rely on territorial depth or resource buffers to survive systemic shocks, but Bermuda possesses neither. It is a strategic outlier, a tiny outpost operating in a state of permanent environmental siege that creates a perpetual doctrine crisis for survival. The danger is not merely the frequency of hurricanes, but the absolute lack of any structural redundancy to provide an asymmetric advantage against nature. If geography were the only factor, this site would be a graveyard of failed ambitions and sunken hulls. To solve the wealth equation, we must look deeper than the surface level. Economics into the very foundation of the rock itself. The answer is found 15,000 feet below the surface, rooted in a violently explosive history that created a natural fortress in the middle of nowhere. This is the Bermuda pedestal. Millions of years ago, a geological hotspot punched a hole through the Earth's crust, spewing lava until it formed a colossal mountain that towered over the Atlantic basin. This was a strategic inflection point for the planet's topography. Today, the island remains in total isolation, far removed from any defensive archipelago or trading partners. The nearest coast is Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, 650 miles to the west. If you were to deploy a vessel due east, you would navigate 3,000 miles of open, unprotected ocean before reaching the coast of Morocco. There is no buffer here, no mountains to break the wind, no neighboring landmasses to absorb the kinetic energy of a storm surge. It is a solitary landmass born from fire, now exposed to the unfiltered fury of the deep blue. As this 15,000-foot volcanic titan began to sink back into the lightless depths of the Atlantic, what biological miracle intervened to stop Bermuda from vanishing forever? The sinking of this 15,000-foot titan was a slow-motion geological disaster. To maintain land above the waves while the foundation retreated required a constant biological reinforcement. This subsidence threatened to erase the island's coordinates before the first human arrival, without a specific structural countermeasure. The pedestal would have vanished into the abyss. A high-stakes race began between geological decay and organic growth. This era defined the very ground of the future colony. The miracle was microscopic maritime organisms building coral reefs around the sinking caldera. These reefs were eventually crushed and compacted into solid limestone. Today, you stand on fossilized remains, not volcanic stone. But this success birthed a fatal geographic drawback. Being porous limestone, the island has zero natural freshwater resources. No rivers, no lakes, no deep aquifers. Rain simply filters through the rock into the salt water below. With no rivers, no lakes, and a rock foundation that literally swallows every drop of rain, what brilliantly simple architectural secret allowed a thirsty civilization to survive on a giant sponge of salt and stone? Thirst is the ultimate enemy of territorial occupation. A population without water faces rapid operational erasure. Relying on external logistics for basic hydration is a strategic failure. The porous limestone acts as a sieve, turning traditional survival into a sunken casualty. This environmental vulnerability created a permanent doctrine crisis for early settlers. Without a breakthrough, the colony was a doomed experiment. The answer was the white-stepped roof, a system that transforms every home into a tactical rain harvesting unit. This asymmetric advantage allows the island to sustain 64,000 people without a single river. Beyond this, Bermuda sits in the Sargasso Sea, warmed by the Gulf Stream's oceanic space heater. This current allows tropical life to thrive far north, but it carries a lethal cost, while this oceanic space heater transforms a lonely rock into a tropical paradise. What terrifying price does Bermuda pay for being the only thing standing in the path of the Atlantic's most violent heat-seeking predators? The Gulf Stream is not merely a thermal asset. It is a meteorological catalyst for violence. This oceanic conveyor belt creates a thermal corridor that attracts the Atlantic's most destructive kinetic forces, turning a tropical paradise into a kill zone for a stationary target. Being the sole obstacle in a path of high-velocity atmospheric disturbances is a recipe for operational erasure. There is no strategic depth here to absorb the impact of a sustained thermal assault. The island exists in a state of permanent exposure, a solitary bullseye for the planet's most efficient heat-extracting machines. This is the doctrine crisis of a territory that enjoys the climate of the tropics without the geographic protection of the tropics. The price is absolute. Bermuda sits directly in the firing line for North Atlantic hurricanes moving up the eastern seaboard. Because the water is warm, these storms maintain their lethal velocity, slamming into the limestone pedestal with the full, unfiltered brunt of the Atlantic's fury. This is a theater of catastrophic impact where Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes are routine. With no mountains to break the wind and no surrounding landmasses to absorb the storm surge, the environment is battered into submission. By all strategic logic, this should be a desolate rock, and for millions of years it remained exactly that. When human expansion finally reached these coordinates, the island represented a strategic inflection point in the Age of Discovery. In 1505, Spanish Captain Juan de Bermudez discovered a blank slate that defied the norms of the era. There was zero native population, unlike the Caribbean, no indigenous civilizations had ever occupied this ground. It was a complete vacuum of human activity, yet the Spanish refused to secure the asymmetric advantage of this location. Why did the battle-hardened Spanish Empire, after stumbling upon a strategically perfect island in 1505, flee in terror from a blank slate paradise they eventually branded the Isle of Devils? The Spanish abandonment of these coordinates was a total psychological collapse. For a global empire, leaving a blank slate in the Atlantic created a massive vulnerability in their maritime doctrine. They were seasoned explorers, yet they treated this landmass as a zone of total exclusion. Superstition overrode the strategic necessity of territorial acquisition, creating a profound doctrine crisis. This perceived curse acted as a barrier more effective than any military blockade. The source of this terror was a biological misinterpretation. The demonic shrieking was actually the mating calls of native birds and the grunts of wild pigs. Branded the Isle of Devils, the island sat empty for another century. When the Sea Venture sailed directly into the heart of a massive hurricane in 1609, what desperate gamble did the ship's admiral make that would finally break the century-old curse of the Isle of Devils? The Isle of Devils functioned as a psychological barrier that neutralized English maritime expansion for a century. Any vessel entering these waters faced a high probability of total operational loss. This was not a mere navigational hazard. It was a zone of perceived supernatural hostility that created a permanent doctrine crisis for colonial planners. Breaking this curse required a moment of total desperation where the fear of drowning outweighed the fear of demons. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of the English colonial project in the West. In 1609, the strategic inflection point arrived when Admiral George Somers' ship, the Sea Venture, was caught in a massive hurricane. With his vessel rapidly sinking, Somers executed a high-risk maneuver by intentionally driving the ship into the reefs. This gamble saved all 150 souls, transforming a disaster into a permanent foothold. After 10 months of reconstruction using native timber, the myth of the cursed wasteland was dismantled, leading to official colonization by 1612. Now that the Isle of Devils was officially an English colony, how did the first settlers survive their first week on a rock where the very ground beneath their feet was designed to swallow every drop of life-saving rain? Thirst is a silent assassin in the theater of colonial expansion. Establishing a permanent presence on a limestone sponge meant fighting a war against the very geology of the island. Traditional survival doctrines dictate that fresh water is the primary strategic requirement for any sustainable occupation. In Bermuda, the absolute lack of surface water represented a systemic failure of basic life support. Settlers were effectively stranded on a fortress that offered no internal sustenance, creating a logistics nightmare of the highest order. To fail at securing a reliable supply was to accept operational erasure by dehydration. This existential threat demanded a total re-engineering of the human habitat. The answer was a masterclass in architectural adaptation that weaponized the island's only abundant resource, the limestone itself. Colonists began carving the rock into a distinct step terrace pattern for their roofs, painting them white to reflect the sun and purify the rainwater. These steps acted as a deceleration system, catching every single drop of precipitation and funneling it into large underground cisterns. This was not just a design choice. It was a survival mandate that eventually became a permanent part of the territory's building code. However, once the water problem was solved, a new doctrine crisis emerged. The land was a dead end for agriculture. The soil was too shallow and the island too small to compete with the massive plantations of Virginia or the Caribbean. Realizing that farming was a strategic failure, the colony executed a cutthroat pivot toward the ocean. They utilized the famously strong native Bermuda cedar to build agile vessels, transforming from a failed agricultural outpost into a maritime powerhouse. Bermudians dominated the regional salt trade and exploited the asymmetric advantage of privateering, essentially state-sponsored piracy, to intercept enemy cargo. For a century, this legalized theft fueled the economy, but the eventual outlawing of privateering and the end of the golden age of sail left the island staring down total economic ruin. With piracy outlawed and the golden age of sail dead, how did a bankrupt 21-mile rock use its highly unusual relationship with the British Crown to engineer the ultimate loophole in the global financial system? The collapse of maritime trade left Bermuda facing total operational erasure. Any other micro-territory would have disintegrated, but the island utilized a hidden strategic depth within British law. This was a tactical retreat into the architecture of sovereign identity. Survival depended on a constitutional anomaly that created a doctrine crisis for the global economy. By exploiting this gap, they reached a strategic inflection point that redefined their national survival. The answer is their status as the oldest British overseas territory. While protected by British military might, the island is almost entirely self-governing. This hybrid status is their asymmetric advantage. Their parliament, active since 1620, writes internal laws that include zero corporate income tax. They ceased building ships to provide a sovereign harbor for the world's money. By weaponizing their own history of near extinction, what high-stakes multi-billion-dollar safety net did Bermuda invent to ensure that when the rest of the global economy collapses, the island's bank accounts only grow larger? The global economy operates on a razor's edge where a single catastrophic event can trigger a cascading failure of the entire insurance sector. If a major insurer collapses under the weight of billions of dollars in claims, it isn't just a corporate bankruptcy. It is the absolute erasure of personal wealth for hundreds of thousands of citizens. This systemic vulnerability creates a permanent doctrine crisis for governments worldwide. Most regimes are defenseless against these massive, concentrated shocks to their capital reserves. To survive, the world required a specialized financial shock absorber capable of offloading this catastrophic risk into a more stable theater. The solution is a high-stakes industry known as reinsurance, essentially insurance for insurance companies. Imagine a scenario where a Category 5 hurricane slams into the Florida coastline. A regional entity would suddenly face 100,000 simultaneous claims, a liability that would ensure immediate operational erasure. By transferring a massive chunk of this risk to a secondary layer, the primary insurer secures an asymmetric advantage. This is where Hamilton, Bermuda, enters the theater as a geopolitical superpower. Despite its size, this city is the epicenter of the global catastrophe market. Because of its unique British status and lack of corporate income tax, it attracts the world's largest property catastrophe reinsurers. When a massive earthquake strikes Japan or a wildfire ravages California, it is often Bermudian companies writing the checks. They have moved from rating ships to underwriting the world's worst days, paying out roughly 30% of all reconstruction claims following major United States hurricanes, in a world where rising ocean temperatures are fueling more frequent and ferocious hurricanes. Why has the very climate crisis that threatens to sink most islands actually become the secret engine behind Bermuda's record-breaking explosion of wealth? Rising ocean temperatures should signal the operational erasure of a low-lying limestone outpost. As hurricanes increase in kinetic intensity, the liability for an entity that underwrites disaster claims becomes mathematically unsustainable. In a traditional theater of risk, increased volatility leads to a total collapse of capital reserves. This creates a global doctrine crisis for the reinsurance industry. However, Bermuda has identified a strategic inflection point where the increase in global instability directly correlates to a surge in their own institutional leverage. They have moved past the threat of climate destruction and into the era of climate monetization. The answer lies in the desperate global demand for high-level risk transfer. As global warming fuels more ferocious storms, standard insurance firms are panicking and must offload their exposure, driving premiums to record heights. Bermuda does not gamble blindly. They employ armies of the world's elite climate scientists and data analysts to build mathematical models that price this risk with surgical precision. They have turned atmospheric instability into a predictable and highly profitable asymmetric advantage. This macro-level financial dominance creates a staggering human reality for the 64,000 residents living on this 21-square-mile rock. Despite having a gross domestic product per capita well over $100,000, the island remains a high-cost environment of extreme logistical difficulty, because every metric of survival from fuel to food must be imported across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The cost of living is the highest on the planet. $100,000 a year barely secures a middle-class existence in a territory where the ground is a fortress, but the shelves are a supply chain hostage. Bermuda remains the ultimate geographic paradox. It is an island with no resources and no water that transformed its greatest curse into its greatest economic asset. Bermuda turned a desolate, waterless rock into the world's most expensive fortress. But what happens when 2,000 people try to survive on a single rock in the middle of Africa's greatest lake with even fewer resources?